Governor Jon Huntsman, when did you first think about running for president?
As we were departing China just this year. Of course, there's always talk about higher office when you're a governor. I would dismiss that as nonsense and never really focused on the presidency until we returned home from China. And there were some folks who actively had organized and thought there was room for another candidate who brought a real-world problem-solving approach to our challenges as a nation. We looked at the situation, analyzed it, and as a family decided that we'd get in the race.
What do you bring to this campaign? What's your message?
Well, I think we bring a very realistic, common sense approach to, first of all, recognizing the situation that we face, which is a desperate, dire, difficult economic set of circumstances, where you've got high unemployment, record debt, the most difficult economic situation since the Depression, and people hurting, and people not just hurting, but people downright frightened about their circumstances and about their future. So I think in order to address that, three things are going to be important as we go forward. I think I bring all three of these to the race. One, private sector experience, where you've got somebody who understands the fragility and the importance of the free market and what it means to job creation going forward. Because as far as the eye can see into the 21st century, we're going to have to be creating jobs as a country. And you need a president who understands the dynamic of the free market system. Number two, having someone who's been a successful chief executive, a governor who's actually managed the state with something to show for it. In our case, taking a great state to number one in terms of job creation, the best environment, most propitious environment for business, so said many magazines, the best managed state in America. I think all that's very important, and the results speak for themselves. I think that will be a very important consideration by the voters. And number three, someone who understands the unpredictable nature of the world in which we live, because it's not going to get any better going forward. It's going to remain unpredictable. It's going to remain a dangerous place. I've lived overseas 4 times. I have an intimate knowledge of our most significant economic relationship, China, and what I think is our most significant strategic challenge going forward as well, China. And I think that is something that will be of great value in the Oval Office.
I want to talk about politics and your experiences, most notably as the ambassador to China, but let's talk about you. Born where?
Born in California.
Raised in California.
I was born in the Navy. My father was in the Navy at the time. Born in Palo Alto. My mother left the naval base in San Diego when my dad was out to sea on tour, and I was delivered in Palo Alto. She went up to live with her parents for a little while. My grandfather at the time, who had a small hardware store in Palo Alto, was mayor of Palo Alto. Then Palo Alto had, of course, nothing more than Leland Stanford Junior University and a lot of undervalued real estate. My other grandfather, Grandfather Huntsman, was principal of Los Altos High School. So they were both in the Bay Area. Both families were in the Bay Area. Following that, we went, of course, back to San Diego to the Navy base. And following my dad's departure from the Navy, moved to Los Angeles, where he took a job with a couple of my uncles in a very small egg distribution business. So I spent the first part of my life in Southern California.
What was your dad's experiences like? What were they like in the Navy?
Well, he was NROTC, and he followed what his father had done. His father was a naval officer, too. In fact, on both sides of my family, I come from naval officers. So there was an expectation in my father's family that if you did it right, you would rise up and become an educator, like my grandfather. You would serve in the Navy, which is what he had done, and his 3 sons all did the same thing. So my father was involved in the Navy just right before the Vietnam War, the early 1960s. So he served his 2 to 3 years, consistent with the NROTC commitment, got out and went into business after that.
You dropped out of high school. Why?
I thought I could be a musician. I left a couple of classes hanging my senior year. I'd been junior class president the year before, ran for senior class president, lost. Thought I could make it in music. We started a rock band, and I pursued that for about a year and a half. only to find that that wasn't to be my future, and went back to more traditional life.
What instrument did you play, or instruments?
Keyboards, piano, rock organ, synthesizer. I still play to this day. In fact, I had a band as governor. We used to practice in the basement of the governor's mansion and used to warm up for various bands that would come to town, visit the state of Utah. I love music, all kinds of music. I've got a daughter who is a concert pianist. I've got a son who's a guitar player. I have another son who's a drummer. And so music has always been an important part of my life.
Is there a Huntsman band?
Well, there was a Huntsman band in the basement of the governor's mansion. I played keys, my son played guitar, my other son played drums, and we had a few other musicians who rounded out the band. And we would play every now and again, and I thought we were decent. I'm not sure we would have made the cut to tour as a club act, but if we had spent a little more time at it, I think we could have made something of it.
Did you ever write a song?
Yes, wrote some of our own original music that was influenced more by the music trends of the 1970s, where you had more art rock, more classical rock, long version songs where you had multiple chord progressions, you had solo breaks, the kinds of things that you don't find much in today's music, but was very much on display in the late 60s and through much of the 1970s, before disco then ran it out of town.
So from your perspective, who had the greatest influence in music, at least in your generation?
Oh, you would have to say probably the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, since they were at the cutting edge of rock and roll, at least during my generation. And they gave rise to, of course, the rock and roll that we experienced in the 60s and then into the 70s, which then turned, heavily influenced by the UK, which then turned to more classical rock and inspired, I think, a lot of bands here in the United States who then picked up their own varieties through the 70s and the 1980s. But I'm a traditionalist in that sense. I think that probably the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and Who were probably among the most influential bands of my generation.
So what's on your iPod?
My iPod would include some music from the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s, a heavy dose of Foo Fighters. I'm a big Foo Fighters fan, more of a recent band. I have some music by Muse. I have Rachmaninoff's Third Concerto, which I like. That adds a little bit of diversity. On the jazz side, I have Return to Forever, Chick Corea's band, Stanley Clarke, Al Di Meola, some of the best musicians ever to come together to form a band. So it's a fairly eclectic offering.
So your own music career begins to fizzle away. You get your high school diploma, then what?
Well, I went then on to college. I served as a Mormon missionary overseas when I was 19 years old. Lived in Taiwan for 2 years, where I was introduced to the Chinese language, which for me has been a fascination. It's taken me back to Asia multiple times, something that I picked up and continued studying through college. It's all consistent with my fascination with the East Asia region, where I saw it on display as a young man in the late 1970s. Lived in Taiwan right as the United States, or shortly after the United States had pulled its diplomatic relationship with Taiwan and formally recognized mainland China, the government in Beijing. So I saw the diplomatic tectonic shifts that were taking place in the late 1970s, and for the first time, as a young man overseas, felt the power of the United States, the consequences of the United States from a foreign policy standpoint. And you see and you feel that much differently living overseas than you do here domestically. So that left a very lasting impact on me. And it certainly influenced my course of study in college, which was political science and international politics, and certainly had an impact on what I chose to do in life.
Well, let's talk about Asia. Do Americans understand Asia, and does the U.S. policy reflect a policy specifically towards China that you think is appropriate?
We have, I think, insufficient knowledge of Asia. We don't quite understand the economic implications of the rise of Asia and what that means in terms of our own competitiveness. So when you look into the 21st century, It's going to be a much different century because it will be a century based on economic competition. And the players pretty much all reside in the East Asia Pacific region, aside from the United States. And so the implications are fairly profound. If you visited China, for example, 10 years ago versus today, the differences are absolutely phenomenal. I'm one who believes that in order to truly understand the economic implications of the rise of Asia and the way in which society has so transformed itself, you have to have visited on a very regular basis, because the rise of Asia, and specifically the rise of China, it's all happened so quickly. And the change of society, the development of society, the rise of their economy is so significant, so consequential, with profound implications for our own country. I don't know that we've focused enough attention on what it means. So to have a president who actually has been plugged into the rise of Asia, what it means for the United States in terms of how we compete in the 21st century, I think is going to be very important.
So what should we be doing that we're not, specifically towards China, economically, politically, foreign policy?
Well, I could give you a list of more academic answers, but I would have to tell you that we've got to get our own house in order. If we're going to compete with the Chinese, if we're going to do what needs to be done as a competitive nation in the 21st century, we have a little nation building to do here at home, which is to say get our economic house in order. Our core is weak. Our economic core is broken. We don't have the leverage we used to have in the U.S.-China relationship. And I have to tell you that we're not going to project that might, even though we're still 25% of the world's GDP, until such time as we get our own economic house in order. So longer term, I would argue that the best U.S.-China policy is that which must take place right here on the home front, and that's getting our economy back in working order, which is to create a more competitive environment here. We don't have an environment that is conducive to job growth. Our taxes are dilapidated. They're anachronistic. They need to be changed. They need to be updated. They need to be simplified, flattened, and made more competitive. We have regulatory barriers and a lot of red tape that makes it difficult for business startup and indeed for us to maintain any real industrial base in this country. And I think there are things like energy independence that are real opportunities for this country that could be job creators and allow this economy to really move forward in ways that would benefit this nation. It's all there. It all needs to be done in order for us to rebuild that core. And rebuilding that core, I think, will have a significant impact on how well then we're able to compete in the 21st century against the likes of China and India.
You've talked often in the last couple of days about taxes and revenue. So clear up the issue of how you bring down a $14.5 trillion debt. Do you do so simply by cutting spending? Should revenues be on the table, and if so, where?
Well, I like the Ryan plan. First of all, we have to be realistic about where we are. Our economy has hit the wall. And if you were in the banking sector, you would say that effectively we're in a workout position right now. So you look at the Ryan plan, you look at what it talks about in terms of Medicare. We can't keep doing things the way we've been doing it year after year. We fundamentally have to change the dynamics of entitlements. And that's going to mean Social Security, and that's going to be Medicare. And what the Ryan plan calls for in terms of the changes to Medicare, I think are absolutely right on. And that is, creating more of a marketplace, creating something more akin to Medicare Part D, something very similar to what we have done in creating an insurance connector in the state of Utah and trying to close the gap on the uninsured there. We have no choice. We have to change the rules of the game. You can guarantee people above 55 years of age that we will hold true to our commitment as a country, but those under 55, I think that dynamic is going to have to change, and we're going to have to show more flexibility. We're going to have to broaden the marketplace. When you've got Medicare, where the average human being is paying in over his or her lifetime $100,000 and taking out $300,000, I mean, the system is upside down. So I like what Paul Ryan says about that. I completely subscribe to the changes in Medicare. In Social Security, we're going to have to take some bold measures as well. We're going to have to back out the retirement age. Why? Because we have no choice. We're going to have to move it to something closer to the 85th percentile of the average length of life. we're living a whole lot longer than we were in 1935 when Social Security came about. So a combination of moving the retirement age and maybe indexing the underlying numbers to CPI as opposed to the assumptions that today are being used. Those two things alone, I think, would make a significant impact on Social Security.